The word useless echoed louder than the music, and in that moment, everything in her life split in two. The crystal chandelier above the ballroom cast a cold, glittering light over Emily Carter as she stood frozen, one hand resting instinctively on her 7-month pregnant belly, the other gripping the edge of the marble table just hard enough to keep herself steady while the murmurs around her faded into a low, suffocating hum. Daniel Brooks didn't raise his voice, didn't need to. His words carried the quiet authority of a man who had built his fortune from nothing and now believed he owned everything in the room, including her. "You heard me," he said, sliding the envelope across the table with deliberate precision, the paper whispering against polished stone like a blade being drawn. "This marriage is over." For a second, no one moved. Then the envelope stopped inches from her fingertips, and Emily stared at it as if it might disappear if she refused to acknowledge it, as if 12 years of loyalty, sacrifice, and silence could somehow outweigh the finality of ink on paper. Around them, the gala continued in fragments, soft jazz, the clink of champagne glasses, distant laughter. But here, in this small circle of light, the world had narrowed to a single, irreversible moment. "Go on," Daniel added, his tone almost bored now, as though this were just another contract negotiation. "You always said you trusted me." The irony hung in the air, sharp and bitter. Emily's lips parted, but no sound came out. Instead, her eyes drifted, not to Daniel, but to the woman standing just half a step behind him, close enough to suggest ownership, far enough to pretend innocence. Chloe Bennet. Younger, flawless, composed in a way that only came from never having to fight for anything. And then Emily noticed it, the subtle curve beneath Chloe's tailored dress, the careful way her hand rested just below her ribcage, protective, deliberate. The realization didn't hit like a blow. It sank slowly, quietly, like something inevitable finally arriving. "Congratulations," Chloe said softly, her voice smooth, almost sympathetic, but her eyes held no warmth. "I hope you understand, this is what's best for everyone." Best for everyone. Emily blinked once, and the room seemed to sharpen, every detail suddenly too clear. The condensation on Daniel's untouched drink, the reflection of her own pale face in the glass table, the way the guests nearby were pretending not to watch while listening to every word. Daniel exhaled, impatient now. "You've been comfortable for too long, Emily. You don't contribute. You don't adapt. I need a partner who can keep up with where I'm going." He gestured subtly toward Chloe, toward the future he had already chosen. "Not someone who's stuck. Useless." The word lingered between them, heavier than anything else he'd said. For a brief second, something flickered behind Emily's eyes, not anger, not even sadness, but something quieter, something unreadable. Her grip on the table loosened. Her shoulders straightened, just slightly. And when she finally reached for the envelope, her hand didn't tremble. She didn't look at the documents inside. She didn't argue. She didn't beg. Instead, she lifted her gaze and met Daniel's eyes fully for the first time that night, her expression calm in a way that didn't match the situation. "I see," she said, her voice steady, almost soft. A pause. A breath. Then, with a faint, almost imperceptible nod, she added, "I hope she gives you everything you deserve." For a moment, Daniel frowned, as if something about her tone didn't sit right, as if there was a piece of the conversation he hadn't quite caught, but the thought passed as quickly as it came. Because in his world, this was already finished. What he didn't see, what no one in that room saw, was the way Emily's eyes lingered for half a second longer, not on him, but on something far beyond him, as if she were already stepping into a future none of them could imagine. The elevator doors closed with a soft chime, sealing Emily Carter away from the noise, the eyes, and the version of herself that had just been dismissed as if she were nothing more than a line item removed from a balance sheet, and for the first time since the words were spoken, she exhaled fully, her reflection staring back at her from the mirrored walls, composed, controlled, almost unfamiliar. As if the woman who had just been publicly replaced no longer existed. The ride down felt longer than it should have, each passing floor marked by a quiet mechanical ding that echoed like a countdown, and with every second, the weight of what had happened began to shift, not heavier, but sharper, more defined, as if clarity had replaced confusion. She did not cry. Not when the doors opened into the marble lobby, not when the night air hit her face with a cool breeze that carried the faint scent of rain, and not when the valet rushed forward, offering assistance she declined with a simple shake of her head. Outside, the city moved as it always did, taxis gliding past, headlights streaking across wet pavement, strangers laughing, arguing, living entire lives that had nothing to do with the quiet ending of hers. Emily walked past it all without hesitation, her heels clicking softly against the sidewalk, steady, measured, intentional. There was no hesitation in her movement, no pause to look back, because somewhere between the moment Daniel slid those papers across the table and the moment she stepped into the elevator, something fundamental had shifted. He thought he had made a decision for both of them. He thought he had closed a chapter. What he did not understand was that he had simply unlocked one. Her phone vibrated once in her hand, the screen lighting up with a single name, Victor Hayes. She did not answer immediately. Instead, she stood at the curb for exactly 3 seconds, watching the traffic, letting the world continue around her as if nothing had changed, because in a way, everything had. Then she answered. Yes, she said, her voice calm, even, carrying none of the emotion that might have been expected after what had just happened. There was a pause on the other end, not of confusion, but of recognition, as if the answer confirmed something that had been waiting for the right moment. Are you ready? Victor asked, his tone professional but edged with something deeper, something that suggested this was not a new conversation, just one that had been delayed. Emily's gaze lifted slightly, her eyes catching the reflection of a towering glass building across the street, its top floors glowing against the dark sky. I have been ready, she replied, and there was no hesitation in it now, no trace of doubt. Another pause, shorter this time. The board is assembled, Victor said. They have been waiting for your confirmation. Emily stepped forward as a black car pulled up to the curb, the driver already stepping out to open the door, as if this had been arranged long before tonight, as if her exit from that ballroom had always been part of a larger plan. She did not ask how long. She did not ask who knew. Some answers did not need to be spoken yet. As she slid into the back seat, the city lights reflected across the window, breaking into fragments that shifted with every passing second. She placed one hand gently over her stomach, a small, instinctive gesture that grounded her in the present even as everything else moved forward. Then let us not keep them waiting, she said quietly. The door closed. The car pulled away. And somewhere across the city, in a room filled with people who understood power in ways Daniel Brooks had never imagined, a chair at the head of the table remained empty for exactly 12 more minutes before the doors would open again, and everything he believed to be secure would begin to unravel in ways he would not see coming. The conference room was silent in a way that carried weight, not emptiness, the kind of silence that existed when every person present understood that something significant was about to happen but no one knew exactly how it would unfold. And at the center of that silence sat a long glass table surrounded by men and women who controlled companies, markets, and decisions worth hundreds of millions of dollars, all of them waiting. All of them watching the closed doors at the far end of the room as the clock on the wall ticked forward with quiet precision, each second stretching just enough to build tension without breaking it. Victor Hayes stood near the head of the table, his posture relaxed but his eyes sharp, scanning the room with the calm awareness of someone who had orchestrated moments like this before, and when one of the board members finally spoke, the question was simple but loaded. Is she coming? Victor did not answer immediately. Instead, he glanced at his watch, a subtle movement that drew every eye to him, and then, with the faintest hint of a smile, he said, She is always on time. As if the words themselves had triggered something inevitable, the doors opened. Not abruptly, not dramatically, but with a controlled, deliberate motion that matched the atmosphere inside the room, and the sound of heels against polished flooring followed, steady and unhurried, each step carrying a quiet authority that did not need to announce itself loudly to be understood. Emily Carter stepped inside. The change was not in her face, not in her posture, but in the way the room reacted to her presence, because one by one, Without instruction, without hesitation, every person seated at that table stood up. No one spoke. No one questioned. The shift in power was immediate and absolute, and for a brief moment, the only sound was the soft echo of her footsteps as she moved toward the head of the table, her gaze sweeping across the room with calm precision, acknowledging each person not with a smile, but with recognition, as if she already knew exactly who they were and why they were there. Victor stepped aside, not as a gesture of politeness, but as a confirmation of position, and when Emily reached the chair at the head of the table, she did not rush to sit. Instead, she placed her hand lightly against the back of the chair, her fingers resting there for just a second longer than necessary, grounding the moment before she finally took her seat. "Thank you for your patience," she said, her voice steady, clear, carrying effortlessly across the room without the need to be raised. The board members followed her lead, sitting only after she had settled, and the energy shifted again, from anticipation to focus. A screen behind her came to life, numbers, charts, and acquisition structures appearing in sharp detail, but Emily did not look at it immediately. Instead, she folded her hands in front of her, her expression composed, her presence commanding without effort. "Let us begin," she said. Victor tapped a tablet, and the first slide expanded, revealing a familiar name that caused a subtle ripple through the room. Brooks Holdings. No one reacted openly, but the recognition was there, sharp and immediate, because everyone in that room understood what that name represented in the market, and more importantly, what it would mean if it changed hands. Emily's eyes moved to the screen now, not with surprise, but with quiet acknowledgement, as if she had seen this outcome long before anyone else. "As of this morning," Victor began, his tone measured, "we have secured controlling interest through a series of acquisitions executed over the past 18 months. 18 months. The number hung in the air, heavy with implication, because it meant that while Daniel Brooks believed he was building his empire, something else had been building quietly alongside him, unseen, calculated, precise. Emily leaned back slightly in her chair, her hand once again resting over her stomach for just a moment, a small gesture that went unnoticed by most but not by Victor, whose gaze flickered briefly before returning to the room. "Proceed," she said. The next slide appeared, and with it, the full scope of what had been set in motion began to unfold, piece by piece, detail by detail, a strategy so complete that by the time it would reach its final stage, there would be only one outcome left standing, and for the first time that night, somewhere far across the city, Daniel Brooks's name was no longer the one in control of his own future. The first sign that something was wrong did not come with panic or headlines or even a raised voice. It came quietly, buried inside a routine morning report that Daniel Brooks almost dismissed as a minor discrepancy, the kind that happened in large operations all the time, numbers shifting slightly, percentages adjusting within acceptable margins, nothing that should have demanded his attention. And yet something about it lingered just long enough for him to look twice. He stood in his office, floor-to-ceiling windows stretching behind him, the city spread out below like a living map of everything he believed he controlled, and as he scrolled through the figures on his tablet, his jaw tightened almost imperceptibly. "That is not possible," he said, more to himself than to anyone else. Across from him, his chief financial officer shifted slightly in his chair, careful, measured, choosing his words with precision. "We thought it was a reporting delay at first," the man explained, "but it has been consistent across 3 separate divisions." Daniel's eyes narrowed, his focus sharpening now, the calm confidence that usually defined him giving way to something more alert, more analytical. "Explain it clearly," he said. The numbers appeared on the screen, projections, ownership percentages, and subtle movements that, when viewed individually, meant very little, but when placed together formed a pattern that could not be ignored. "Over the past 18 months, the chief financial officer continued, small portions of our shares have been acquired through third-party entities, each transaction below the threshold that would trigger disclosure requirements. 18 months. The same number that had echoed in a different room across the city just hours earlier. Daniel set the tablet down slowly, his fingers tapping once against the glass surface of his desk as his mind began to connect pieces that had previously seemed unrelated. "Who?" he asked, his voice controlled but edged with something sharper now. The chief financial officer hesitated, just for a fraction of a second, and that hesitation was enough to shift the atmosphere in the room. "We are still tracing the ownership structure," he said, "but the acquisitions appear coordinated." Coordinated. Intentional. Daniel turned slightly, his gaze moving toward the skyline, but he was no longer seeing the city, he was seeing patterns, timelines, decisions, and for the first time in a long time, something did not align with his expectations. Behind him, the door opened softly, and Chloe Bennet stepped inside, her presence as polished and composed as always, her hand resting lightly against her stomach in a gesture that had already begun to feel natural to her. "You are late for the meeting," she said, her tone light, unaware of the shift that had already begun to take place. Daniel did not respond immediately. Instead, he picked up the tablet again, his eyes scanning the data one more time, as if the answer might reveal itself if he looked hard enough. "Cancel it," he said finally. Chloe paused, surprised, her brows drawing together slightly. "Cancel it?" she repeated. Daniel turned now, fully, his expression no longer relaxed, no longer certain, but focused in a way that suggested something deeper was unfolding beneath the surface. "There is a problem," he said. The words were simple, but they carried a weight that Chloe had never heard from him before. "What kind of problem?" she asked, stepping closer. Daniel's gaze flickered briefly, not to her, but to the numbers again, to the pattern that was no longer random, no longer explainable as coincidence. "The kind," he said slowly, "that does not happen unless someone planned it." The room fell quiet again, but this time the silence was different, not controlled, not deliberate, but uncertain, as if something invisible had entered the space and shifted everything just enough that it could no longer be ignored. And somewhere in the back of Daniel Brooks's mind, a thought began to form, incomplete but persistent, a sense that something he had already dismissed, something he had already walked away from, might not have been as insignificant as he believed, and for the first time, the future he had been so certain of felt slightly, dangerously out of his control. The meeting request arrived at 9:12 a.m., not marked urgent, not flagged as critical, just a standard corporate communication that would have been ignored on any other day. But today nothing felt standard, and Daniel Brooks noticed it immediately, his eyes locking onto the sender's name as if it carried a weight that had not been there before. He read it once, then again, slower this time, each word settling into place with increasing clarity. "Request for executive meeting regarding strategic partnership and restructuring discussions." No company name in the subject line. No unnecessary details. Just a time, a location, and a signature that made his fingers pause for a fraction of a second longer than they should have. Carter Global Technologies. Chloe leaned slightly over his shoulder, her expression curious, her voice light but edged with concern. "Who are they?" she asked. Daniel did not answer right away. Instead, he leaned back in his chair, his gaze still fixed on the screen, his mind moving faster now, connecting timelines, acquisitions, the quiet pattern that had been forming beneath his awareness. Carter Global. The name was not unfamiliar, but it had never been directly relevant to him, not until now. "They are not just anyone," he said finally, his voice lower, more measured than before. "They are the ones buying." Chloe's brows furrowed, confusion flickering across her face. "Buying what?" Daniel turned the screen slightly, showing her the data, the ownership shifts, the pattern that no longer looked like coincidence. "Us," he said. The word hung in the air, heavy, undeniable. Chloe straightened, her hand instinctively moving to her stomach again, a subtle gesture that betrayed a moment of unease. "That is not possible," she said quickly. "You would have known." Daniel's jaw tightened slightly, not in anger, but in realization. "I should have," he replied. The silence that followed was different from before, sharper, more focused, because now the uncertainty had a shape, a direction, and most importantly, an origin. Chloe stepped back, her voice softer now. So what do they want? Daniel's eyes returned to the message, to the simplicity of it, the precision. A meeting, he said. And when someone like this asks for a meeting, they are not asking. He stood up, the movement decisive, his earlier hesitation replaced by a controlled urgency. Clear my schedule, he added. Chloe hesitated again, just briefly. You are going? She asked. Daniel looked at her then, fully, his expression calm but no longer comfortable, no longer certain. I am going to find out who thinks they can move against me without being seen, he said. But even as he spoke the words, something in his tone shifted slightly, as if a part of him already knew that the answer would not be as simple as he wanted it to be. Across the city, in a building that stood taller, quieter, and far less visible than his own, preparations were already complete. The conference room had been reset, screens dark, documents arranged with exact precision, every detail controlled down to the placement of a single pen on polished glass. Victor Hayes stood near the window, looking out over the skyline, his posture relaxed, but his attention absolute. Behind him, Emily Carter reviewed the final document, her expression unchanged, her focus steady, as if this moment was not the culmination of something complicated, but simply the next logical step in a sequence she had always understood. He accepted, Victor said without turning. Emily did not look up immediately. Instead, she finished reading the line in front of her, her fingers closing the folder with quiet finality. Of course he did, she replied. A brief pause. Then, with a calm that carried more power than any raised voice ever could, she added, He still believes this is his decision. Victor allowed himself the faintest smile. And in exactly 11 minutes, he said, glancing at his watch, he will realize it never was. Emily stood, smoothing the front of her coat with a small, precise motion, her hand resting briefly over her stomach once more before falling back to her side. Good, she said softly. Then let us make sure he understands everything he missed. Daniel Brooks arrived 3 minutes early, not out of courtesy, but out of control, because arriving early meant observing first, calculating first, and most importantly, never walking into a situation blind, and as he stepped out of the elevator into the quiet, understated lobby of Carter Global Technologies, the difference was immediate. There were no loud displays of wealth. No exaggerated statements of success, just clean lines, muted tones, and an atmosphere that suggested power did not need to prove itself here. The receptionist greeted him by name before he spoke, her tone polite, precise, as if his arrival had been anticipated down to the second. Mr. Brooks, they are expecting you, she said, gesturing toward a private corridor that led away from the main floor. No waiting area? No delay. Daniel noticed that. As he walked down the hallway, the sound of his footsteps seemed sharper than usual, each one echoing just enough to remind him that he was not the one controlling the environment this time. Behind him, his assistant tried to keep pace, but even she seemed to sense the shift, her usual confidence replaced by quiet observation. At the end of the corridor, a set of double doors stood closed, unmarked, but somehow more imposing than any branded executive suite he had ever entered. Daniel stopped for half a second, just long enough to register the unfamiliar feeling settling in his chest, not fear, not yet, but something closer to uncertainty. Then the doors opened. The room beyond was expansive but restrained, a long table stretching across the center, screens embedded seamlessly into the walls, and seated along one side were individuals Daniel recognized instantly, not from personal relationships, but from reputation, people who did not attend meetings unless the stakes were significant. Victor Hayes stood as Daniel entered, offering a brief nod that acknowledged his presence without conceding anything more. Mr. Brooks, he said, his tone neutral, controlled. Thank you for coming. Daniel stepped forward, his posture straight, his expression composed, the version of himself that had closed deals worth hundreds of millions settling back into place as instinct took over. When someone starts buying my company without introducing themselves, I make the time, he replied evenly. A faint ripple moved through the room, not laughter, not reaction, just recognition of the statement. Victor inclined his head slightly. There, he said. Please have a seat. Daniel's gaze moved across the table, assessing positions, reading subtle cues, and then it stopped, just briefly, at the chair at the head of the table. Empty. His eyes narrowed slightly. Are we waiting for someone? He asked. Victor did not answer immediately. Instead, he glanced toward the doors behind Daniel, a small, deliberate movement that shifted the entire focus of the room. We are, he said. And then, as if timed to the exact second, the sound of heels echoed softly from behind. Daniel turned. The doors opened again, slower this time, the motion controlled, deliberate, and the figure that stepped through did not rush, did not hesitate, did not acknowledge the tension that had instantly filled the space. Emily Carter walked in as if she had never left any room in her life. For a fraction of a second, Daniel did not react, because the image did not align with the expectation in his mind. The woman he had dismissed hours earlier did not match the presence standing in front of him now, composed, self-assured, carrying a quiet authority that did not ask for recognition, it commanded it. No one spoke. No one moved. And then, without looking at him directly, Emily crossed the room, her steps steady, her gaze forward, and took the seat at the head of the table that had been waiting for her all along. Only then did she lift her eyes to meet his. Mr. Brooks, she said calmly. Thank you for coming. For a moment, Daniel Brooks did not move, did not speak, because the reality in front of him refused to align with the version of events he had already accepted, the version where Emily Carter had walked away quietly, diminished, irrelevant, and yet here she was, seated at the head of a room filled with power, acknowledged without question, positioned without explanation. And the silence that followed her greeting stretched just long enough to force him to respond. Emily, he said finally, her name sounding unfamiliar on his tongue now, as if it belonged to someone he had never fully known. There was no anger in his voice, only confusion wrapped in restraint. Emily did not react to the tone. Instead, she inclined her head slightly, a gesture of acknowledgement that felt more formal than personal. We prefer to keep things efficient here, she said calmly. So I will move directly to the point. Victor tapped the screen, and the data reappeared, clearer now, expanded, every acquisition, every percentage, every timeline laid out with precision that left no room for interpretation. Daniel's eyes followed it, scanning quickly, his mind working through implications faster than most people in the room could comprehend. But even with that speed, the conclusion arrived too quickly to be denied. This is your structure, he said, looking back at her. Not a question. A realization. Emily folded her hands lightly on the table, her posture unchanged, her expression steady. It is, she confirmed. A quiet shift moved through the room, not surprise, but acknowledgement of what had just been made explicit. Daniel exhaled slowly, his gaze dropping for a fraction of a second before returning to her, sharper now. 18 months, he said. You have been doing this for 18 months. Emily did not correct him. Yes, she replied. No explanation. No apology. Just confirmation. Daniel leaned back slightly, the weight of that timeline settling into place, overlapping with memories, decisions, moments he had dismissed as insignificant. Why? He asked, the single word carrying more complexity than anything else he had said. Emily's eyes held his for a second longer this time, not with emotion, but with clarity. Because you built your company on the assumption that control meant permanence, she said. And it does not. The answer was not what he expected, and that alone shifted the balance further. So this is what? He pressed. A takeover? Emily's gaze flickered briefly toward the screen, then back to him. It is a transition, she said. One that has already happened. The distinction was subtle, but final. Daniel's jaw tightened slightly, not in anger, but in recognition that the conversation he thought he was having was already behind him. You think you can just walk in and take everything? He asked. There was a hint of disbelief now, not loud, but present. Emily's expression did not change. No, she said quietly. I did not walk in. A pause. Just long enough for the words to settle. I was already there. The room remained silent, but the weight of that statement shifted something deeper, because it suggested that what Daniel saw as an external move had in fact been built from within his own blind spots. He glanced at Victor, then back at the data, then back at Emily, as if searching for the missing piece that would restore his understanding of the situation. And what happens now? He asked. This time, the question carried something new, not control, not authority, but the beginning of uncertainty. Emily leaned forward slightly, her hands still calm, her voice even. No, she said. You decide how much of your company you want to keep. The words settled into the room with a precision that made them impossible to ignore, not loud, not dramatic, but final in a way that shifted the entire balance of power without needing to raise a voice. And for the first time since he walked in, Daniel Brooks did not respond immediately, because the question Emily Carter had placed in front of him was not one he could control, not one he could redirect, and not one he could dismiss as irrelevant. He studied her, carefully now, not as someone he had once known, but as someone he was trying to understand for the first time, his eyes searching for hesitation, for weakness, for any sign that this was a performance rather than reality. But there was none. Emily remained still, composed, her presence grounded in something deeper than confidence, something that did not need validation from anyone else in the room. You are assuming I have already lost, Daniel said finally, his voice measured, steady, reclaiming what control he could through tone alone. Emily's expression did not shift. I do not assume, she replied. I verify. Victor tapped the screen again, and the next set of data appeared, this time more direct, more immediate, projections of market response, board voting power, contractual triggers that had already been activated, each line tightening the space around Daniel's position without ever stating it outright. The room remained silent as the information unfolded, because everyone present understood what it meant, even if it had not been spoken yet. Daniel leaned forward slightly, his elbows resting just above the table, his focus locked on the numbers now, because numbers did not lie, and what he was seeing did not leave room for interpretation. You have majority influence, he said, his voice lower now, more analytical. Emily inclined her head once. Yes. A pause. And within 48 hours, that becomes control. The timeline landed with quiet impact, not rushed, not exaggerated, just stated as fact. Daniel's gaze flickered, calculating, recalibrating, moving through options at a speed that had always set him apart, but for the first time, the options were limited, constrained by decisions he had not realized were being made around him. And you expect me to what? He asked. Sit here and agree to this? Emily's hands remained folded, her posture unchanged. No, she said calmly. I expect you to recognize it. The distinction again, subtle but decisive. Daniel let out a slow breath, leaning back slightly, his fingers tapping once against the table as he shifted perspective, not fighting the reality, but adjusting to it. And if I do not? He asked. Emily's gaze held his, steady, unwavering. Then the process continues without your participation, she said. No threat. No emphasis. Just inevitability. The silence that followed was different now, not tense, but resolved, because the outcome was no longer a question of if, but how. Daniel's assistant shifted slightly behind him, her discomfort evident in the small movement, but no one else in the room reacted, because they were no longer watching a negotiation, they were watching a conclusion unfold. Daniel's eyes moved once more across the screen, then back to Emily, and for the first time, there was something new in his expression, not defeat, not yet, but recognition, the realization that the person he had dismissed hours ago had never been in the position he believed she was. You planned this, he said quietly. Emily did not deny it. Yes. A single word, calm, complete. Daniel's jaw tightened slightly, not in anger, but in understanding, because planning required time, patience, and most importantly, intention, and all three had been present without his awareness. Why now? He asked, the question coming softer this time, less about control, more about clarity. Emily's gaze did not waver. Because now, she said, you are finally paying attention. Daniel Brooks did not look away this time, because looking away would mean conceding something he was not ready to name, and yet the longer he held Emily Carter's gaze, the more it became clear that whatever advantage he believed he still had was no longer part of this room, no longer part of this conversation, and the realization did not arrive all at once, it unfolded in layers, quiet, controlled, undeniable. You said I am finally paying attention, he repeated, his voice steady but slower now, as if each word required more precision than before. So tell me what I missed. It was not a challenge. It was a request for clarity. Emily did not respond immediately. Instead, she reached for the folder in front of her, opening it with a smooth, deliberate motion, her eyes lowering briefly as if confirming something she already knew by memory rather than by need. When she looked back up, her expression had not changed, but there was a shift in the weight of her presence, something more personal beneath the surface of control. You miss patterns, she said. Not numbers. Not markets. Patterns. Victor remained still, but his attention sharpened, because this was no longer just a business explanation, this was something deeper, something that extended beyond contracts and ownership. You assumed consistency meant loyalty, Emily continued, her tone calm, even, but precise in a way that cut through the room without force. You assumed silence meant agreement. You assumed that because something did not challenge you, it supported you. Daniel's jaw tightened slightly, not in anger, but in recognition, because the statements were not accusations, they were observations, and that made them harder to dismiss. And you? He asked. You said nothing for 18 months. Emily inclined her head slightly. Yes, she said. Because you were not listening. The words landed without emphasis, but their impact was immediate, because they reframed everything that had happened, not as sudden change, but as ignored signals finally reaching their conclusion. Daniel exhaled slowly, his gaze shifting for a fraction of a second, not away from her, but inward, recalculating not just the present, but the past, moments that now carried different meaning. So this is about proving a point? He asked. Emily's expression remained steady. No, she said. This is about establishing reality. A pause. Just long enough for the distinction to settle. Then, without raising her voice, without shifting her posture, she added, You called me useless. The room did not react outwardly, but the air changed subtly, because this was the first time the conversation had crossed into something personal, something that connected the present moment to the one that had triggered it. Daniel's expression flickered, just briefly, a memory surfacing that he could not ignore. Emily did not press it. She did not repeat it. She simply allowed it to exist in the space between them. You evaluated value based on visibility, she continued. If you could not see it, you assumed it was not there. Her hand rested lightly against the table now, her fingers still, controlled. That is a dangerous way to measure anything. Daniel's eyes dropped for a fraction of a second, then returned to hers, sharper now, but no longer dismissive. And now? He asked quietly. Emily held his gaze. No, she said. You are seeing it. The simplicity of the statement carried more weight than anything else she had said, because it confirmed what could no longer be denied, that the person he had underestimated had never been in the position he assigned her, and that everything unfolding in front of him was not new, it was revealed. Daniel leaned back slightly, his hand resting against the edge of the table, his posture still composed, but the certainty that once defined him no longer absolute. You built all of this without me noticing, he said. Emily did not correct him. Yes. Another pause. Then, with the same calm precision that had defined every word she spoke, she added, The difference is, I noticed everything. The room did not move, did not shift, because at this point movement would have implied uncertainty, and there was none left to justify it, only decisions waiting to be made, and Daniel Brooks understood that now in a way that was no longer theoretical, no longer strategic, but immediate and personal. He looked at the screen one more time, not searching for errors, not expecting reversals, but confirming what he already knew, that every path forward had already been shaped, and that the only variable left in the equation was how he chose to respond to it. "So you built leverage," he said slowly, his voice steady but stripped of its earlier confidence, replaced by something more precise, more deliberate. "Not to destroy the company." His eyes lifted to meet hers again. "But to control it." Emily Carter did not correct him. "Yes," she said. No hesitation. No explanation. Just confirmation. Daniel nodded once, a small movement, but significant, because it marked the moment where resistance shifted into recognition, where denial gave way to analysis. "And what happens to me?" he asked. The question was direct now, not defensive, not challenging, but clear, because for the first time he was no longer speaking as the person in control of the outcome, but as someone who needed to understand his position within it. Emily's gaze held his, steady, unchanged. "That depends on you," she replied. Victor stepped forward slightly, placing a document on the table in front of Daniel, the pages aligned perfectly, the terms already finalized, already structured. "There are two paths," Victor said, his tone neutral, professional, as if outlining standard options rather than the conclusion of a carefully constructed strategy. "You retain a minority position, remain on the board in an advisory capacity, and transition operational control over the next 90 days. A brief pause. Or the process continues without your cooperation, and your position is diluted accordingly." The distinction was clear. Participation or removal. Daniel looked down at the document, his eyes scanning quickly, absorbing details, timelines, percentages, clauses that had been written with precision that left no room for negotiation in the traditional sense, because this was not a negotiation, it was an offer shaped within a reality that had already been established. His fingers rested lightly against the edge of the paper, but he did not touch it yet. Instead, he looked back up at Emily. "You are giving me a choice," he said. Emily inclined her head slightly. "Yes," she replied. Daniel studied her for a moment longer, searching not for weakness now, but for intention, for the reason behind the structure she had put in place, and what he found was not anger, not resentment, but clarity, a clarity that suggested this had never been about reaction, but about decision. "You could have taken everything," he said quietly. "You have the leverage." Emily's expression remained composed. "I do not need everything," she said. "I need alignment." The word carried weight, not as a demand, but as a standard. Daniel let out a slow breath, leaning back slightly, his gaze shifting briefly toward the window, toward the skyline that had once represented his control, his certainty, his future, and then back to the table, to the document, to the reality in front of him now. "And if I agree?" he asked. Emily's voice remained calm. "Then you remain part of what you built," she said. "Just not in the way you expected." The room stayed silent, because there was nothing left to add, nothing left to clarify, only a decision waiting to be made, and Daniel Brooks understood that this moment, more than any deal he had ever closed, more than any expansion he had ever led, would define not just his position, but his understanding of everything that had brought him here. Slowly, deliberately, he reached for the pen placed beside the document, his fingers closing around it as the weight of the choice settled fully into place, and for the first time, the man who had always dictated outcomes paused just long enough to consider what it meant to accept one. The pen felt heavier than it should have, not because of its weight, but because of what it represented, and Daniel Brooks understood that with a clarity that no amount of negotiation experience could soften, because this was not about numbers anymore, not about strategy, but about acknowledgement, about accepting a reality that had been built without him noticing and now stood fully formed in front of him. His fingers tightened slightly around the pen, just enough to steady the movement, and for a brief second, his eyes lifted from the document to Emily Carter, searching not for permission, but for confirmation that this moment was as final as it felt. She did not nod. She did not speak. She simply watched, her expression composed, her presence unchanged, as if the outcome had never been in question. Daniel lowered his gaze again and signed. The movement was controlled, deliberate, each stroke of ink precise, because even now, he would not allow himself to appear uncertain. Even now, he maintained the discipline that had defined his success. But when the pen left the paper, something shifted, subtle but undeniable, a line crossed that could not be undone. He placed the pen back on the table with care, aligning it beside the document as if restoring order to something that had already been redefined. No one in the room reacted immediately. There was no applause, no acknowledgement, only a quiet understanding that the decision had been made and the process was now complete. Victor stepped forward, collecting the document with the same precision he had used to place it, his expression neutral, professional, but his eyes flickered briefly toward Emily, a silent confirmation that everything had unfolded exactly as planned. Daniel leaned back slightly in his chair, his hands resting lightly on the table, his posture still composed, but the energy around him had changed, not diminished, but redirected, as if he were adjusting to a new position rather than resisting it. 90 days, he said, his voice steady, more measured now, the earlier tension replaced by something closer to acceptance. Emily inclined her head. 90 days, she confirmed. A pause followed, not uncomfortable, but reflective, because in that moment, there was nothing left to negotiate, nothing left to prove, only the quiet aftermath of a decision that would reshape everything moving forward. Daniel's gaze moved briefly to the screen, to the data that had once represented his control and now represented something else entirely, and then back to Emily. "You did not have to do it this way," he said quietly. It was not an accusation. It was an observation. Emily's expression remained calm. "I did," she replied. "Because this is the only way you would have seen it." The honesty of the statement left no space for argument, because it did not attempt to justify, it simply stated what was necessary. Daniel exhaled slowly, a small movement, but significant, because it marked the final release of resistance. "And now I see it," he said. Emily held his gaze for a moment longer, and for the first time, there was the faintest shift in her expression, not softness, not forgiveness, but acknowledgement. "Yes," she said. Around them, the room began to move again, subtle, controlled, the kind of movement that followed conclusion rather than chaos, documents being organized, screens dimming, conversations beginning in low, professional tones, but at the center of it, the space between them remained still, defined not by what had been lost, but by what had been revealed. Daniel stood, smoothing his jacket with a small, automatic motion, his posture straight, his presence intact, but different now, shaped by a reality he had not anticipated. "You built something remarkable," he said, his voice steady. Emily did not respond immediately. She simply watched him, her expression unchanged, and then, with the same calm precision that had carried her through every moment of this encounter, she said, "I always had." The room gradually returned to motion, but the center of gravity had shifted permanently, and as conversations resumed in low, controlled tones, Daniel Brooks remained standing for a moment longer than necessary, as if recalibrating not just his position in the company, but his understanding of everything that had led him here, and when he finally turned toward the door, it was not with defeat, but with a quiet awareness that the version of control he once held no longer existed in the same form. The doors opened for him without hesitation, just as they had when he arrived, but the walkout felt different now, not because the environment had changed, but because he had, and the sound of his footsteps no longer carried the same certainty, replaced instead by something more measured, more reflective. Behind him, the meeting continued without pause, because it had never depended on him to begin with, and at the head of the table, Emily Carter remained exactly where she belonged, her posture composed, her focus already shifting forward, beyond what had just been resolved and into what came next. Victor leaned slightly toward her, his voice low, precise. "Integration timeline begins immediately," he said. Emily nodded once, her attention already on the next set of documents, the next sequence of decisions, because for her, this moment was not an ending, it was a continuation, a transition into a position she had been preparing for long before anyone else realized it. "Notify the teams," she said calmly, "and adjust the projections to reflect the new structure." Her tone carried no triumph, no need for recognition, only direction, because this had never been about proving something, it had been about establishing it. Hours later, across the city, Daniel stepped into his office again, the same space, the same skyline stretching beyond the glass, but nothing felt quite the same, and as he set his keys down on the desk, his eyes drifted toward the tablet still resting where he had left it earlier that morning, the data unchanged, but his perspective entirely different. Chloe Bennet was waiting for him, her expression expectant, her posture composed but edged with tension that had been building since he walked out without explanation. "What happened?" she asked, her voice controlled, but no longer light. Daniel did not answer immediately. Instead, he loosened his jacket slightly, a small gesture that suggested the weight of the day had settled into him more deeply than he intended to show. "It is done," he said finally. Chloe's brows drew together. "Done?" she repeated. "What does that mean?" Daniel met her gaze, and for the first time, there was no attempt to simplify, no effort to protect the version of reality she expected. "It means the company is no longer entirely mine," he said. The words landed with quiet impact, and Chloe's expression shifted, confusion giving way to disbelief. "That does not make sense," she said quickly. "You built everything." Daniel's gaze held steady. "Yes," he said. "But I did not see everything." The distinction settled between them, heavier than explanation. Chloe stepped back slightly, her hand resting against her stomach again, but this time the gesture felt less certain, less assured. "So what happens now?" she asked, her voice softer, less confident than before. Daniel turned toward the window, looking out over the city that had once reflected his certainty, his control, his future, and now reflected something else entirely, something more complex, more precise. "No," he said slowly. "I learned what I missed." Back in the high rise across the city, Emily stood by the window of her own office, the skyline stretching out before her, her reflection faint in the glass, her hand resting lightly over her stomach for just a moment before falling back to her side, her expression calm, steady, untouched by the noise that had defined the earlier part of her day, because for her, there was no need to look back. No need to revisit what had already been resolved, only the quiet understanding that what had been dismissed as invisible had never been absent, only unseen. Morning arrived without ceremony, the kind of quiet, steady transition that does not announce itself but changes everything all the same, and in the days that followed, the shift that had begun in that conference room unfolded across the company with the same precision that had defined its origin, leadership structures adjusted, reporting lines realigned, decisions made not with urgency, but with clarity. And at the center of it all, Emily Carter moved through each moment without hesitation. Not as someone stepping into power, but as someone who had always understood how to carry it. Meetings that once revolved around approval now revolved around direction, and the tone throughout the organization changed in ways that were subtle but undeniable, because when leadership is grounded in certainty rather than assumption, everything else follows. Across the city, Daniel Brooks adapted in his own way, attending the first advisory session with a focus that surprised even those who had worked with him for years. Because he was no longer speaking to control outcomes, he was listening to understand them, and that shift, though quiet, marked the beginning of something different, not lesser, but more aware. He watched the numbers, the structures, the strategies unfold under Emily's direction, and for the first time, he saw not just what was being done, but how it had been built, layer by layer, decision by decision, all while he believed he was the only one shaping the future. Chloe Bennet remained part of his world, but the dynamic between them had changed, not through conflict, but through absence, the absence of certainty, the absence of assumptions that once held everything in place, and as she observed the new reality, she began to understand something she had not considered before, that proximity to power is not the same as possessing it. In her office, Emily stood once more by the window, the skyline stretching out before her in clean lines of glass and light, her reflection steady, her posture unchanged, and for a moment she allowed herself to be still, not in reflection, but in acknowledgement, not of what had happened, but of what had always been true. Her hand rested briefly over her stomach, a quiet, grounding gesture, a reminder that what she was building extended beyond companies and contracts, beyond ownership and control, into something more lasting, something that did not need validation to exist. Victor stepped into the room, pausing just inside the doorway. "The transition is complete," he said. Emily nodded once, her gaze still on the city. "Good," she replied. A brief silence followed, not empty, but full of understanding, because there was nothing left to explain, nothing left to prove. After a moment, she turned away from the window, her expression calm, her presence unchanged, and walked toward the door, each step measured, intentional, as it had always been. And somewhere behind her, in a world that had once overlooked her completely, the truth settled into place with quiet finality, that value does not disappear when it is ignored, it waits, it builds, and when the moment comes, it does not ask to be recognized, it simply becomes undeniable, because some people do not lose everything in a single moment, they lose it slowly. In the spaces where they chose not to see what was already there.